know me well. If I've said that I'm going to, send something, or if I've forgotten to start the recording, please don't be shy and tell me. Know me well. If I've said that I'm going to, okay. If I've said that I'm going to send something, or that I'm going to start a recording, or I haven't posted the recording, please let me know, because I can sometimes be forgetful. So please keep me updated. I think, you know what, we can get started. All right, well, I'm Rabbi Sydney. Hello, most of you know me. For some, it's been a while, but I'm originally from Los Angeles. Even those who do know me don't know everything. So I'm originally from Los Angeles. I'm a big fan of yoga and dogs and piano. I'm also a big fan of God, and we'll learn more about that a little bit later. I've been in Shreveport at Agudath Achim for 2 years now, 2.5 years, almost 3, since July 2019. So most of my time here has been during the pandemic. And I live just a few blocks away from here with my husband, Rabbi Feivel, and with my 2 dogs, with Buddy and Jax. So if you're ever in class on Zoom, like now, you are welcome to turn the camera to your dogs, or to your dogs, or to children as well, because that'll always make me happy, and I'm sure it'll make other people happy as well. So I know that in this space, we're coming here with lots of different ideas and experiences of Judaism. So some of you have not learned much about Judaism before. Actually, I think everybody in this space here right now on the screen has learned quite a bit about Judaism before, but some of you haven't had formal education about Judaism, and some of you have had lots. So what I'd love for us to do is to start out with a question. The first question, actually with a few questions. The first question I'd love for us to ask, or first set of questions, I should say, are these 4. And what I'd love for you to do is, if you have access to that, the PDF, the week 1 PDF that I sent out, then you can use that. If not, get a piece of paper and write down your answers to these 4 questions. 1, what your experience is with Judaism so far. 2, what you find most attractive or compelling about Judaism. 3, what's most troubling or confusing about Judaism to you now. And 4, why you're here. And in a few minutes, we'll go around, we'll introduce each other. You won't have to share all of your answers, but I'd love for us to take just 5 minutes to write down our answers to these questions. And our answers might be different today than they were yesterday, or than they will be tomorrow. I'll check in just a couple minutes. How are we with timing? If you're done with answering these questions, I invite you to give me a thumbs up. Okay. Got some thumbs up. Eddie's here in the room. All right. So what I'd love for us to do, even if you're not done completely with all of the questions, what I'd love for us to do is to go around, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself, where you're coming from today, and to choose one of these questions that you answered, and share your insights on those questions. I'd love, Eddie, can you be our guinea pig?
Yes, ma'am, definitely. All right, my name is Eddie. I was born in Cuba, moved to California. Came from there as well, and I'm in the military. That's how I ended up here in Shreveport. What was that?
And so first of all, can you all hear Eddie okay? Yeah, great. And so choose one of those questions that you answered.
What I find most attractive and or compelling about Judaism is going to be being able to worship Hashem and being able to basically join the overall, because Judaism isn't just a religion, it's a people as well. And I find that most attractive, being able to join and to live my life in that way.
Amazing. Thank you. All right. How about Curtis?
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Awesome. So my name's Curtis. I'm also military, also here in Shreveport. I'm here right now, honestly. So my wife is converting to Judaism. She took this class about a year ago. So she should be finishing up her conversion here in a couple months. And so I've been the whole time just asking probing questions, and she's like, you should honestly just take this class if you want to learn more, to be able to speak to it. So I was like, okay, that's awesome. So I'm here for her. And I'll go with I think that community and peace is the most attractive, compelling piece of Judaism. Really love that. And my most troubling, kind of confusing piece coming from a Christian background is the focus on a lot of the rabbinical debate. And I hope we go into a little bit of that because I find it very confusing and kind of detracts from maybe the overall message when it's like, hey, you can't eat at this time for this reason, and here's why, or we don't put dairy in this. So those kind of things fascinate, and it's interesting that we have that culture and that piece around it. So I'd be interested to learn more about that.
I love that you're both fascinated with it, and it's also kind of
I like learning about it, but it's also like, why? I don't. If your overall greater message is we're here to support and love God and be better people. Sometimes I'm like, why does it matter if I have the right kind of undergarment that's under my shirt right now? And that part just is interesting, but is also it's the dual edge there.
I'm excited to talk about it. Thanks, Curtis. And I am so sorry. It's been since college, so I can't remember. Are you Anna or Anna?
I'm Anna.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
No worries. So my name's Anna. I live in New York City. I met Rabbi Sydney in college before she was Rabbi Sydney. And I'm here because I am Jewish. My mother's Jewish. I'm a half. But since my mother's Jewish, I am Jewish. And I was raised without a lot of formal Jewish education. We were a very secular family, although I would say my mother's family is very culturally Jewish. And as I have become an adult and as I've gotten older, I found myself very drawn to Judaism and more comfortable identifying as Jewish and identifying as a Jewish person. But since I don't have much formal education, a lot of my learning and celebration of religion and culture is very self-taught at this point. So my celebration of high holidays and my understanding of specific dates and customs is all very self-taught at this point, because while my family is very culturally Jewish, I would say I was not raised with religion. But it's something that I have long wanted to explore more of. And yeah, so I'm really excited to kind of be here and dive in a little bit more.
Great, excited to have you. And especially because you're in New York City, there are a lot of places you can explore, and I'm happy to talk with you about where you can go looking also.
Awesome.
I don't know how much they're doing in person, but
not a lot.
When that becomes more of a thing. How about Candace and Jade?
Okay, I'll go first. I'm Candace Richardson. I took this class last year because I wanted to convert to Judaism, and I'm doing that in just a few months. I took the class with Curtis's wife, Tessa. See Curtis all the time. I guess the one I will answer is the first one. My experience has been pretty awesome. I came from having never met a Jewish person to frequenting a synagogue to now being 3 months out from my conversion. So yeah. Take it away, Jane.
Well, I guess the one I want to answer comes from that. Well, I'm Jade, and I kind of had a similar background, had no knowledge of Judaism at all before my friend broke her ankle, and I became her ride to prayer service on Fridays. And ongoing, I really found a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a really long time. And I really want to explore more to, one, maintain that, and just, there are a lot of customs and practices that appeal to me and make me feel more spiritually sound. But, there's so much, it's pretty overwhelming. Well, yeah, overwhelming. And I just, really want to learn more.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody. So what I want to start out with is to talk a little bit about what we're going to learn, because I know, Jade, you said it's overwhelming and it's a lot, and we're not going to learn everything, but I want to go over what we are going to learn and where you can go to learn more. Because what I found is that that people who are interested in looking into Judaism, we tend to do a lot of reading and a lot of online research. And one of the first things I want to do is make sure that the reading and research that we're doing at home is stuff that makes sense. So first of all, format of the class. How this is going to work is that each week we're going to meet either at a Good Achim or online, your choice, at 7 p.m. Central, which is different times for some of you. Next week we're going to start out in person again. If it's not in person, I'll let you know by email. But I think next week we'll be back in person for those who are in Shreveport. But again, you can be on Zoom if you'd like. We're going to be having lots of different formats of learning. I like to ask lots of questions from you. So if you're having a day when you're either physically not able to ask questions because you're, say, chopping vegetables, or you just don't feel like talking, let me know beforehand and I won't call on you. But I will ask lots of questions throughout, and you're always welcome to pass and say you don't want to answer questions. If you're somebody who doesn't like reading out loud, let me know that too, and I'll keep that in mind for next time. I just, in the syllabus, wrote this note about on Zoom or in person. So I just talked about that, but also I did update class dates. So we are not going to Israel as the Jewish Federation of North Louisiana, at least not this year. Candace, I know you're sad, but what that means is that the next time we do it, maybe you can come. So when we reschedule, so not all terrible. But if you look at our syllabus every week, what it's going to say is it's going to give you the topic and it'll give you a link to the textbook. Now, our textbook, I know, Eddie, you had asked this. The textbook shows up online or in person. So if you paid the full price for the whole class, you'll get a textbook. If you'd like to buy a textbook, it's $30. Happy to ship it to you, or you can pick it up from the synagogue. But those should be coming in next week. But also you can get it for free online, and I'll always have a couple of copies printed out of the class for those who are coming in person. But the links to the Dropbox files are in the syllabus. And also on here, I have some holidays that are coming up. And I have on here some of the things that we're doing for the holidays in the Shreveport community. A lot of the things are streamed online in the Shreveport community, so you can always live stream. But even if not, like you can't really live stream helping us with gardening on Monday. Even if not, there will probably be things in your area that you can do to celebrate, and I'll help you figure out what those things are. So there's a little bit about each of these classes that we're taking, and you can read through all of these things on your own. But what I really want to go over with you are some helpful books. Now, I know that I've gone through this with a couple of you, but I think it's always worth going through again. Look through this list and click through. If you're a person who really likes to read books, this first group of books are some introduction to Judaism books, and they're very comprehensive, but they're all kind of a different style. So Anita Diamant comes from a progressive feminist lens. Choosing a Jewish life is about the conversion process to Judaism, and living a Jewish life is about introduction to Judaism in general. Wayne Dosick and Joseph Telushkin both have very comprehensive scholarly ways of looking at Judaism. Sarah Hurwitz is kind of a memoir. Her book is kind of a memoir of her journey finding out more about Judaism. And Harold Kushner is scholarly but very happy about how great Judaism is. So look online, read some book excerpts if you're interested. These are great books to start out with. If you know a little bit about Judaism to start out with already, these are some books that dig a little bit deeper. So if you're interested in Kabbalah, we will not learn much about Kabbalah here. I think I'll talk about Kabbalah for about 15 minutes. I think it's cool. I don't know much about it, but I love Pinchas Giller's book about it. It's a great introduction to Kabbalah. If you want to learn more about conservative Judaism in general, The Observant Life is a great, very thick book about what conservative Jews believe about everything. And anything by Elliot Dorff can help you with that too. So Elliot Dorff is an ethicist and a rabbi and a mensch, one of the best people you'll ever meet, who's one of my professors, and is a wonderful human being and writes just wonderful things, both about conservative Judaism and about ethics in all different forms of Jewish ethics. Arthur Waskow, I'm going very out of order. Let's go back in order. So Abraham Joshua Heschel writes The Sabbath, which is a little book about how great Shabbat is, and it's just a wonderful read for everybody. Back to the Sources is a great book about Jewish texts. And so maybe for Curtis, that might be interesting. Why do we care about all these conversations? That's a good book that goes into that. And Arthur Waskow is a beautiful, his book is a great exploration of Jewish holidays that goes very deep. For Hebrew Bibles, I like to give this list because there are lots of Bibles out there that you can look at. What makes a Hebrew Bible is it is derived from the Hebrew translation. So the translation comes directly from the Hebrew, and B, it doesn't include the New Testament. So those are two things that make it the Hebrew Bible. We'll go more into that next week and a little bit today as well. But these are some of my favorite editions. The JPS Illustrated Children's Bible is actually one of my favorite things. Even though it's a children's Bible, if you don't feel like reading through all of this, or if like some of the wording is confusing, the JPS Illustrated Children's Bible gives you a couple pages at a time about what the story is, the big Jewish stories. And so that's a great place to start out. I sometimes will look there if I've got a class starting in 5 minutes and I need to review what this story is about. So I'd recommend this for everybody, even if you're not a child, although we're all children in some way. And these are Sidurim, these are prayer books. And so I would, if you are interested in thrice daily prayer, or even once daily or once weekly prayer, or just want to have a prayer book in your house and want to know which one to buy, let's have that conversation, because it's sometimes not so easy to navigate on your own. But I've given little descriptions about some of my favorites here. The last thing I want to do before we get into the learning is online resources. So like I said before, we don't always know when we're reading sources online how accurate they are or what the bias is. Please know that if you're looking for Judaism online, a lot of the time messianic sources will pop up. Most of us know this, but just to be clear, in Judaism, Jesus isn't a part of our religious tradition at all. So if your online site talks about Jesus, it's probably not a Jewish site. Oh, we've got someone else. All right. Hello to David. So here are some of the Jewish sites that I like to look at. For everyday answers, you can always email me. Most of you here have my cell phone number. I will usually text back. And so email me, text me if you have an everyday question, or if you want to search online, mydewishlearning.com and Jewish Virtual Library, both great sites. Sefaria.org has all of Tanakh online, but also has lots of other primary sources as well. And hebcal.com has an online Hebrew calendar that you can download onto your calendar if you'd like to have that. I've got a couple more comprehensive sites on here as well. But if you have kids, or if you learn really well from bright, flashy pictures, I learn well from bright, flashy pictures. Bimbom.com is wonderful, and pjlibrary.org has a great music station and lots of ideas for home practice. And then if you want to learn about Jewish women's history, jwa.org is always a website I like to recommend. So I just threw a lot of information at you. Any questions? Right, great. So let's continue with Torah then. Right. Oh, this gives you the answers. So I'm going to ask you the question, what is Torah? And anyone can answer. What is Torah?
5 books of Moses.
The 5 books of Moses. Great. They're the first 5 books of our Hebrew Bible. Fantastic. What else is Torah?
Would it be the laws that were given to the Jews by God?
Great. So Torah literally means teaching.
Oh, gosh.
And it's the 5 books of Moses. It's also an object that we have in our sanctuary. So if you go to services if you go to a morning service, we'll open up the ark and we'll bring out this big scroll that we call a Torah. So what is the Torah? It's the 5 books it's that handwritten parchment scroll, and it's that law. I love this, the way that, so I get this curriculum from Miller Intro to Judaism program, which is part of American Jewish University. And I love the way that they explain this. This is from Rabbi Adam Greenwald, I think. He says, for some Jews, it's basic to faith that it was entirely from God, dictated to Moses. For other Jews, it's divinely inspired, written through earthly hands. For others, it is an entirely human document, likely composed by multiple authors. But whatever its origins, the Torah is the Jewish constitution, our founding and most essential text. So just right off the bat, while many Jews believe that the Torah came from God, dictated to Moses, in order to be Jewish, you don't have to believe that the Torah is entirely from God, dictated to Moses. There's a whole lot of diversity of belief. And also, please know that if you have questions throughout, raise your hand or put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer. There's also, once you get the textbook, or if you have that file on your computer, there's lots of space where you can write notes if you need. And I'll also post these PowerPoints as well. So the Torah has 5 books, and you may have heard these before. Genesis, which is Bereshit in Hebrew. Bereshit means in the beginning. Exodus, which is Shemot, or names. Leviticus is Vayikra. Numbers is Bamidbar in Hebrew, and Deuteronomy is Devarim. We're going to learn about it in 6 acts, but there are only 5 books of Torah. The first act that we have is what is a sort of prehistory. So this is before the Jewish story. At the very beginning of Torah, we get the creation story. So that's going to be chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. And what you'll find that's kind of interesting, I think is interesting, is that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have competing stories. So there are ways to combine them that they make sense with each other. But if you read Genesis chapter 1 and 2 on their own, they're going to sound like they have competing values and they have competing stories. Just something interesting to look at. I think also there are ways of introducing male and female, or man and woman, or just a human being created are very different as well. So we start out with creation narratives. We continue with Adam and Eve. So these are the first 2 humans we have. Cain and Abel are their children, and we have the story of the first murder. Then humankind gets to be a little bit rambunctious, and everyone's a terrible person, and all the animals are terrible, and God says, all right, done with this, and floods the earth and keeps 2 of each animal. But then, of course, there are inconsistencies, and there are more of some animals, but we don't often hear that in the retelling. But let's just say 2 of each animal, and Noah and his family, and God takes them, puts them on a boat, and floods the earth, and humankind is started again. Right after that story, humankind gets in trouble again and tries to build a tower that reaches towards the heavens. And then God decides, you know what, maybe I should give them all different languages, because this was a little too much. And we can talk for hours about what was actually the wrongdoing in building that tower. That's not what we're going to do today, but I'd love to do that with you in the future. So this is kind of our prehistory. We then have the families. And if you've been to Jewish prayer services, you've heard these names before. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob are our patriarchs, and they are married to Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And I love, what is your dog's name?
Oh, this is Ruthie.
That's Ruthie.
Aww.
I like her. She's very pretty. Anyway, I get distracted by dogs, but they make my day. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob, Rachel, and Leah have a whole lot of children. So you'll see these are all of their children here. And Joseph's story is the very end of the book of Genesis. Within there too, we have some sibling and sister wife rivalries. So Ishmael is Abraham's son with Hagar, who's Sarah's maidservant. Esau is Jacob's brother and is Isaac's favorite son. And then Dinah, we don't hear much about. She is one of Leah and Jacob's children, and she has a terrible story of rape in the Torah that we don't often talk about in religious school. So if you are interested in reading about her, I would definitely suggest reading that, and I'd love to talk to you about it in more detail at some other point in time. So this is our whole story of Genesis, and it actually ends in the land of Egypt because Joseph, at the very end of the story, is the second in command to Pharaoh himself. So Joseph has brought all of the Israelite people down to Egypt, and that's where we end in the book of Genesis. Questions thus far? The fastest overview of Genesis I think I've ever done.
Maybe this is something you're going to get into later, but I'm curious about the competing values that you were talking about at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Just could you elaborate on that a little more? Sorry.
Sure. So for a couple of different examples. So one is in this slide, you'll see in the first chapter of Genesis, we've got a particular order of creation that happens. And then in the second chapter of Genesis, it kind of goes heaven and earth, and then people, and then plants, and then animals. But there are ways to make that synchronous, but it's a little odd when you first read it. I think for me, I can put those together, no problem. But what I find more interesting is in the story of Noah, you'll have one chapter where it says that he needs to take 2 of every kind of animal onto the boat. And then another chapter where it'll say, well, take 7 of every clean animal and 2 of every unclean animal. So how do you put those 2 together? And the measurements are a little bit off when you read different chapters. I think those are the things that those are the weird sections, and there are a couple of different ways to deal with it. So one is that we can figure out literary ways to put things together, right? Another is that we can blame it on there being multiple authors from multiple different time periods who had multiple retellings of the story. And another is that we can say that truth was different back in the time of the giving of the Torah, and that they weren't as worried about scientific inconsistencies as we are today. Does that somewhat answer your question? Great. So Act 2 is where we are. If you ever come to Saturday morning services, this is where we are, not Act 2. Act 3 is where we are. And you can tell that I didn't create this PowerPoint because I didn't know where we were in the PowerPoint. So I'll go back to all of that. But Act 3 is slavery to redemption. So we start out that Joseph has brought all of the people down to Egypt, and everything's great for a while. But then the new Pharaoh forgets Joseph. They've been there for a couple hundred years, and the new Pharaoh says, wow, these people are getting to be too populous, and so we've got to make them slaves. And so we start out where the people of Israel are enslaved in Egypt, and we're introduced to Moses. Hello, David. We're introduced to Moses, and we have the story. We have Moses. God comes to Moses in a burning bush and says, all right, you're going to be the guy to get the people out of Israel, or to get the people out of Egypt. And he says, no, I'm not. And God says, yes, you are. And I'll give you your brother for help. And so Moses and his brother Aaron go to the people Israel. Go to the people Israel and go to Pharaoh. And Moses asks Pharaoh not to let them go for good, but to let them go into the desert so that they can go worship God for a few days, and then they'll come back. But Pharaoh isn't okay with this. So 10 plagues later, which is actually where our Parsha just was this past weekend, our Torah portion, 10 plagues later, we have this coming week's Torah portion where eventually Pharaoh lets the people Israel out of Egypt, and then changes his mind and chases the people Israel into the Sea of Reeds. The sea splits, thanks to God. And then once the people of Israel get on the other side, the sea caves in on the Egyptians. That's going to be this week's Torah portion. So if you're more interested, you can always go to synagogue. After that, we have this revelation at Sinai. What that means is that God comes to the people of Israel and says, here are a whole bunch of rules, both now and when you get into Israel. And among those are the 10 commandments. What's really important to know is that these 10 commandments are not all of the commandments in the Torah. There are a whole lot. The rabbis say 613. That's not really exact, but there are a whole lot more than 10 commandments in the Torah. Also, as part of the Exodus story is the golden calf, where Moses is spending way too much time up on the top of this mountain. The people of Israel are getting bored and decide to build a calf because they can't see God, so they have to create a godly image. They build this golden calf, which is exactly against the commandment not to build idols. And so Moses smashes the tablets of the 10 commandments, goes back up, gets more commandments, and all is well and good for now. The book of Leviticus then will talk about both ritual and ethical laws, specifically about priesthood. That's most of the book of Leviticus. Couple of vocab words to know at this point in the story. Now, in the book of Exodus, that's really when the people Israel become the people Israel. Up until that point, they had been a group of people. They had been the descendants of Jacob, who was renamed Israel. But Exodus is really that point when they are given rules as a group of people. So a couple of words to know when we're talking about these rules as a group of people. One is brit. So the people Israel have made a brit, or a covenant, with God. Brit is also the word that's used for the initiation ceremony for a baby. That's a nice word to say, nice way to say circumcision. But that brit, that covenant between God and the Jewish people, also happens a couple of times in Genesis, just with individual covenants. So Abraham has a brit with God, that Abraham's descendants will be connected to God, that God will be with Abraham's descendants. And the people Israel have this brit, have this covenant with God, starting at Sinai. Another word to know is mitzvah. So mitzvah is a commandment. It's all of the you shall and you shall nots that we hear in Torah, the stuff that we do and the stuff that we're not supposed to do. So that's its primary definition, is literally a mitzvah is a commandment, but it's also colloquially, it's a good deed. So if I helped somebody cross the street, I did a mitzvah. No, if I watched my neighbor's kids for an hour, it's a mitzvah. But it's also it's either a good deed or an actual commandment. This is a great way to look at the division of mitzvot. The rabbis will say there are 613. That's an approximation, but there are mitzvot that are both ritual and ethical. So can you give me an example of a mitzvah that might be a ritual mitzvah? Mitzvah between a person and God.
Is Shabbat candles one?
Yes, that's what I was just about to say. Yes, lighting Shabbat candles, right? It's not directly helping another human being, but it's some sort of ritual that we do. What's another Jewish ritual you might have seen people do?
Let's say fasting on Rosh.
On Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur.
Yes, so fasting on Yom Kippur, fasting on a fast day. That's going to be a ritual mitzvah. And here it says it's a bein adam lemakom, which means between a person and God. So it's a mitzvah between a person and God. There are also mitzvot bein adam lechavero, between a person and his fellow or his friend. So what's an example of a mitzvah between a person and another person? What's a really nice thing you could do?
And just like helping your neighbor in general would probably be
Yeah,
considered that. Okay.
exactly. Helping your neighbor in general. The first one that when I asked my students, my religious school students, give me an example of a mitzvah, the first one that always comes out from the older kids is don't murder. So don't murder is bein adam lechavero. That's an ethical mitzvah, right? It's helping another person not to murder them.
I have a
So
quick,
there are mitzvot both that are ritual and that are ethical. If you get to know me a little bit better, rabbinically, I tend to actually think that there's interplay between the two. You have a question for this?
yeah, would you like with the law of Kashrut, would that be kind of both in that regard? Like it's ritualistic, but it's also technically ethical in how they like handle animals? Is that mitzvot at all?
Interesting. So that's definitely a mitzvah, or it's definitely a set of mitzvot. And I would call that bein adam lemakom, because lechavero, so to another, usually has to do with another
Straight to people.
with another person.
Okay.
But I love that idea though of thinking of kashrut, of keeping kosher, as an ethical mitzvah also, because while we might not think that separating our milk dishes and our meat dishes is such an ethical thing to do, what I think it does is it helps train us to pay attention to the little things. And when we pay attention to the little things, we ultimately are better at paying attention to the little things that somebody else might need at a certain moment in time. So for me, I don't see that much of that clear of a distinction between the two, between bein adam lemakom and bein adam lechavero, because I think they both interplay with one another. I think you can't have one without the other. And also, I do think that those ethical mitzvot, bein adam lechavero, is not just between a person and another person, but ultimately, because God created all of us, any mitzvah that we do for somebody else is a mitzvah for God as well. All right. Act 5, the wilderness. So easy way to explain Act 5, the book of Numbers, is that the people of Israel mess up a lot. If you ever read the book of Numbers, that's all it's about. They spend 40 years in the desert because they're not quite ready to make it into the land of Israel. they don't want to go, and then they say they do want to go, and they fight with each other, and they get hungry. And so 40 years in the desert is that book of Numbers, and we find during that time Miriam and Aaron, Moses's brother and sister, die, and Moses will not enter the promised land because he hit a rock really hard. That's a deeper story for another time as well. Then the entire book of Deuteronomy is a repetition of things we've already heard before. It's a summary of where they've gone and what they've done, and it's all from Moses's point of view. So it's that second telling of what's already happened. One of the things that we hear, in this book of Deuteronomy is a prayer we'll call the Ve'ahavta. If you've been to services, you may have heard this before. We hear the Shema, which is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So we hear that during services a lot, and then there's a paragraph after that. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. So if you listen to both of those, these are from the book of Deuteronomy, and this is one of those tellings of, this is one of Moses's tellings of, here's what you should do once you get in the land of Israel. The Shema is this line, "Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one." And then we've got that line from the Ve'ahavta. And Eddie, would you read this? Would you read this for us? The "You shall love."
You shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day. Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
Great. So this is a great example of a set of mitzvot. And I actually think this is the central paragraph of Torah. What is this commanding us to do?
Basically, keep the words with us at all times.
Keep the words with us at all times. So what are some ways that we can keep the words with us at all times?
Mezuzah.
A mezuzah. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. That's a mezuzah. Great. What about impressing them upon your children? What is that asking us to do?
Teach them to our kids.
Teach them to our kids. Right.
And another one would be tefillin.
Right. Tefillin is binding them a sign on your hand. So tefillin are these black boxes we wear in weekday prayer. We'll wear one on our arm and one on our head. And then what was that other one? Recite them at home and away, when you lie down and when you rise up. What's that asking?
Say in the morning and then the afternoon, or in the night, sorry.
Yeah. So we pray a couple times a day. So it's talking about prayer, but also about learning. So we're constantly trying to engage Jewishly, not just in prayer, but in learning and in conversation. Keeping God on our minds all the time.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is this portion of the Shema, is this what you would recite in the morning and at night, or is there more to it?
There is more to it.
Okay.
So when we recite the Shema in the morning and the evening, this part here is just the introduction that's in Deuteronomy.
Okay.
But this part here is the Shema in the blue. And then this paragraph is the first paragraph of the Shema.
Okay.
The second paragraph is one about reward and punishment. The third is about wearing tzitzit, wearing fringes on your garments. Great. So, of course. So how do we use Torah in Jewish community?
We will learn from it and base our lives based off of it.
Yeah, Shema. We learn from it. We base our lives off of it. But in services also, in Shabbat services and holiday services, and even if you live in a community that's big enough to have 2 weekday services, or to have weekday services in the morning, which unfortunately we don't, unless you all want to come to services every morning. We read out of the Torah. So we have one Torah portion each week. We try to get through all of Torah in 1 year. In our synagogue, we go through the triennial cycle, which means that we actually read a third of each portion of Torah each year. And so we'll go through it every 3 years. But symbolically, we read it through every year because we read a third of each portion each year.
Okay.
Right. What I'd love to do is show this video of somebody writing a Torah, because the Torah itself, not just the words in it, but the Torah as an object is seen as a sacred object. When the Torah stands up, when someone picks up the Torah, we rise. When the ark is opened with the Torah in it, we stand up. And it's seen as a huge deal. Some people will even fast if the Torah is accidentally dropped. So it's given the honor of a person. So we'll show you this video a little bit of how a Torah is made. Please give me a thumbs up if you can hear, because I don't know if the settings are right for this. Okay, good. Oops. Try that again.
The Torah is the 5 books of Moses, and it's the source and base of the Jewish tradition, revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai by God. And we're the people of the book, so this is the book. When a Torah is read in synagogues, it has to be read from a scroll, and it has to be written in a particular way, by hand. My name is Julie Seltzer, and I'm currently working as a scribe, a soferet in Hebrew, which means that I write sacred writings. My role in this exhibit is to write a Torah that will be used in synagogues and in communities that are in need of a Torah. I'm a new scribe. This will be my first complete Torah. It's a science. It's a science that I'm still learning. Traditionally, you go to a school and you learn how to be a scribe as a student of scribing. But as a woman, these schools were not open to me. So in the beginning of my process, I looked online and I taught myself some of the basics. And then eventually I found a teacher. And from there, that's when I really started learning the craft and how to properly form the letters. And it's also when I began learning the laws associated with scribing. You start with parchment. And parchment is made from the skin of a kosher animal. And then there's something to write with, which is the quill, which is, for me, the most challenging aspect currently. cutting the quill from a feather, just getting it the right size, the right sharpness, the right angle, the right flow of ink. Before starting a project, and often during a project, it's traditional to go to a mikveh, a ritual bath, which is really for spiritual elevation. And also before you begin the project, you have to state an intention out loud that you're doing this writing for the sake of the sanctity of what it is that you're writing. A Torah has 304,805 letters. Not one more, not one less, or else the entire thing is invalid. Every letter has rules that govern how the letter has to be written, because a letter can't look too much like another letter. If you look at a Torah closely, there are score lines. At the top of each line, there's an indentation, and it keeps the line straight. Another interesting rule is that there can't be a barrier between the hand and the Torah. I can't wear gloves that cover my hands. Another rule is that you can't write from memory. So even if I chanted this particular section at my bat mitzvah and I know it by heart, I still have to look at the written text, and I have to say each word out loud before I write it. I have the photocopy of the tikkun, so I underline each line that I write so I can follow where I am exactly. If my eye goes to the wrong place, I know where I am. It makes it easier to not make mistakes. The biggest myth about scribing that I've encountered is the myth that scribes can't make any errors, or else they have to start over from the very beginning of the Torah. If and when I make a mistake, if I catch it right then and there, I try to remove as much ink as I can, because it will be easier to scrape off. Some days will be better than others. Everyone has their bad days. Generally, for me, it's a bad quill day, which just means that I'm forming and reforming the quill. But in the end, it's worth it, because if you cut a good quill, then the writing goes really smoothly. Sometimes I'm in the story and I'm experiencing the story as I'm writing it, if it's more of a narrative section. And sometimes I'm really not thinking at all about anything. I'm just writing. But it's meditative. And I'm hearing the words, I'm looking at the words, I'm saying the words. You have to say every word of the Torah out loud before you write it. So I'm saying the word, hearing myself say it, and then writing it. Every single person that writes a Torah is going to write a slightly different looking Torah, even though it's completely anonymous. I'm not signing it. It's not my creative stamp. And I don't want that. It's a submission to something much larger than yourself. There's really nothing different about the Torah that I would create now versus 2,000 years ago in terms of the words and the letters. And that's part of what's amazing about this work, is that I'm writing the same words as have been written for this many years. And for me personally, it just connects me back to something bigger, something greater, something much more timeless than me and my very impermanent, quick visit on this earth.
Great. So Eddie just said that's awesome. What was awesome about it?
How much information was in that. I always thought that if a letter was messed up or something, I was one of those people that thought, oh, you have to start over from the beginning. But that's really interesting.
Yeah. And what it's kind of fun, kind of sad, but kind of fun when a letter is messed up. So when you're reading the Torah, and you find a mistake, there's a whole process. If you find a mistake in Torah, it's considered not kosher. But the way that you check is you find a kid, if there's a child in the synagogue who knows their Hebrew letters, you have that child come up to the Torah and check the letter and tell you what letter that is. And because it has to be clear enough that a child should know how to read it.
Right.
If it's not, then it's not kosher.
Oh.
And then usually at that time, either we'll call a sofer, call a scribe to come out and fix it, or I'll call a sofer friend and they'll tell me how to fix that one letter over video chat, over FaceTime or something, and I'll do it with a pen and scrape it off with an X-Acto knife. Any other questions or observations in that video?
Yeah, I guess the thing that struck me most about it was just the immense amount of respect she had for the work that she was doing. It seemed more like a calling than a job, especially because she kind of talked about how she, and I don't mean this in a weird way, but like she kind of even had to go through back channels to even be able to do it.
Right.
I just thought that was really cool to have that level of commitment and respect for what you do.
Right. And I think especially because she's part of a group of women, they're a collective called Stam Scribes. And they're really the first group of women to kind of come together and do this together and teach each other. I think she initially learned from a male rabbi, but this group of women have come together, and most of them have other jobs as well, but this is a passion project that they do. So, for example, she I think helps to run My Jewish Learning, the website I was talking about earlier, and another scribe I know of who's part of that collective works as a congregational rabbi. And so a lot of people will do that as a side project, but it takes a lot of time. I mean, to write an entire Torah will take a year or two for most people. I think it reminded me too of what you were saying earlier, of the little things and why do we care so much? And this is another one of those times of, why do we care so much if one letter is off? And if we think about it as each letter is a quote of God's word, each letter has to matter. So I always think watching her work and watching any sofer work is just beautiful. And we also we've got to get some sofrim, some scribes into Agudath Achim, because we have 2 non-kosher Torahs now. So hopefully at some point we can watch them work if we get them into Agudath Achim. Hopefully we're not just sending them out. We might have to send them out. I want to come back to one other thing that's part of one last quote that's part of of our textbook and part of our curriculum. We'll see a lot of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, just because he writes so poetically and says things so beautifully. Curtis, would you be up for reading what's on the screen?
Yeah. So it is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religions for its own defeats. Religion declined not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive, and insipid. Let me keep going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion only speaks in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. Religion is an answer to man's ultimate questions. The moment we become oblivious to ultimate questions, religion becomes irrelevant, and its crisis sets in. The primary task of religion is to rediscover the questions to which religion is an answer.
Great. Great. So I think this can be applied to any religious tradition, but I think this is something that we really strive towards in Judaism, is trying to make this religion something that's relevant, and B, trying to ask questions, trying to ask all the big questions.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm going to challenge us to do right now is to put together a list of questions, because we're going to be meeting together quite a lot. I want us to put together a list of questions that we want to make sure we cover during our time together. I'm going to make sure that we start each class with space for questions. If you've been thinking about anything for the past week and wondering about something, or Googled something and couldn't find the answer, we're going to make a lot of space for questions. So off the top of your head, are there questions that you want to make sure are answered during this class? I'll challenge everyone to think of at least one.
If we're converting, kind of like the kippah or kippot, are we able to wear tzitzits? Not the talit, but the talit katan?
Yeah. So what about, so that's a very specific question.
Okay.
So you're asking, if you're in the conversion process, can I wear a talit katan? I think a bigger question is, a bigger question that we can cover, and we'll also cover that topic of talit, that very specific topic. But a bigger question is, what's the deal with ritual clothing? We have a lot of ritual clothing in Judaism, so we can go over some of that ritual clothing that we wear.
I guess my question, and it might be a little bit more broad than you were looking for, is kind of like, what makes a person Jewish? Like, what level of connection, what level of involvement, like, how do we identify it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and that's not a broad question at all. But I love it. We have an entire class on that in 2 weeks. What makes
Awesome.
a person Jewish?
Awesome.
It's a quick answer, but I won't answer it right now. Candace, do you have any questions?
It's not so much like a solid question I have, but something I do want to talk about when we get to like the kashrut part of the class is about vegetarianism in Judaism, because I've done some research into that and like seen some really interesting things and arguments. And I know the sisterhood like talked about that today, I'm pretty sure. So I'd really like to learn more about that.
We did talk about that today. So I'm going to add that into when we talk about kashrut, when we talk about keeping kosher. I'm going to add some of those texts into it. And I can also, Candace, send you the source sheet from today as well. Jade, are any questions popping up for you or topics?
always really bad about being put on the spot. Nothing right now, but I'll definitely let you know.
Sounds good. Sounds good. How about Curtis?
I got kind of two. One's more broad, doesn't have to be answered in the class necessarily. We can do it like offline because I'm a Christian taking this class. But kind of like why, at what point does the Jewish history and text stop? And then the religious view of Jesus as a whole on the Jewish community, like that piece, some kind of answer if it's just a man or what the situation is there, and that can be an offline if you want. And then my other one is more of a how to go about my life as Tess and I progress and want to have kids, just how to be better and more involved in their upbringing, being that they're going to be Jewish born, how to be there for them if I don't convert and I stay Christian, etc.
Right. And so I think we can, of course, we'll talk about all of those things offline as well, because some of those are more personal conversations, but we are definitely going to be talking about having a Jewish family and being in relationship, whether with somebody who's Jewish or with somebody who's not Jewish. And so we will absolutely talk about that. And I can make sure, because I know that you are not the only person in an interfaith relationship on this screen right now. And so we can definitely make that a longer conversation when we get to talking about kids and talking about family as well. And then I don't know if I fully understood your question, but is a good summary of your first question, how does Jesus fit in?
Yeah, I guess that would like, is there a viewpoint at all from the Jewish culture, faith, or just not at all, not mentioned?
Yeah. Is there a viewpoint at all? The short answer is no, there isn't, but there's a longer answer too. But the short answer is no. But we can go over that too. All right. Other questions before we head out? Okay. And if you have others that you think about, please email me, or please let me know at the beginning of class next week. We might answer a couple of these that don't quite fit into the syllabus next week, but I definitely want to start out with answering questions next week. Please let me know any questions you have or any thoughts you have over the next week. This is about how long class is going to take each week. I like to talk for a good amount of time, but usually an hour 15 and an hour and a half is a good amount. It's good to see everyone. I'm really excited to learn with y'all, and have a wonderful week.